My name is Ilana Rabinovich, and I am so pleased to introduce tonight's very special power panel from page to screen. This evening's event features four incredibly accomplished, talented, and award-winning writers, directors, and producers. Richard Crouse will moderate tonight's panel. Richard is the regular film critic for the 24-hour news source CTV News Channel and CP24. His syndicated Saturday afternoon radio show, The Richard Crouse Show, originates on News Talk 1010 in Toronto. He is also the author of 10 books on pop culture history. To all viewers tonight, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Richard will take as many questions as possible at around 7:45. So without further delay, here is Richard Crouse and the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Ilana, and welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually. There's a lot to talk about here, so let's get right at it. Jessica Rodden, who's a cinema blogger at cinemablend.com, wrote, "Putting together a film based on a highly acclaimed literary work full of phrasings and lines of dialogue that have forever been burned into readers' minds is largely a thankless task. Creating a film that maintains the heart and soul of such a literary work and even many of its most graceful lines is nearly impossible to accomplish." So tonight, with that in mind, we're going to ask the distinguished panel to help us understand how to make the impossible possible. So let me introduce everyone. First, we have Margaret Atwood, who is trending on Twitter this morning, so we may ask her a little bit about that later on. She is Canada's most eminent novelist and poet and writes short stories, critical studies, screenplays, radio scripts, and books for children. Her works have been translated into over 30 languages. Films like Alias Grace, The Handmaid's Tale have been made into television shows and films, Payback, Surfacing, just to name a few, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. Emma Donoghue joins us. She wrote the screenplay for a film version of the book Room. Let me just, for the Room, for which she was nominated for an Academy Award, Golden Globe, and a BAFTA. And her stage version is running at Toronto's Princess of Wales Theatre until May 8th. So you still have time to see that. She adapted her 2016 novel, The Wonder, into a film that's coming out from Netflix next year. Sarah Polley is here with us. Sarah is a Canadian actress, writer, director, producer, political activist, screenwriter, and director of films like Away From Her and Take This Waltz. She is the screenwriter of the miniseries Alias Grace, based on the 1996 novel of the same name by Margaret Atwood. Her book, Run Towards the Danger, is available now wherever fine books are sold. Finally, Clement Virgo joins us. His feature films have premiered at TIFF, Sundance, and the Berlin Film Festival. His movies include Poor Boy's Game, Lie With Me, and Love Come Down. Virgo's first feature, Rude, made through the CFC Feature Film Project, premiered at the 1995 Cannes Film Festival. His television directing credits include The Wire, Billions, American Crime, Empire, and Greenleaf, on which he served as director and executive producer with Oprah Winfrey. In 2015, he directed, co-wrote, and executive produced the miniseries adaptation of The Book of Negroes, which debuted to record-breaking numbers on the CBC and BET in the US and was nominated for 2 US Critics' Choice Television Awards and shortlisted for a Peabody Award. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So another quote, Ernest Hemingway once said, "The best way for a writer to deal with Hollywood is to arrange a rendezvous with the movie producer at the California state line. You throw them your book, they throw you the money, then you jump in your car and drive like hell back to wherever it is you came from." So I wanted to ask, and I'll start with Margaret on this one, how difficult is it to turn your work over to someone with an eye towards an adaptation?
Well, once upon a time, I was a screenwriter myself. So I understand that it's a different art form. So you're not transliterating something's word for word. You're making something that is mostly pictures and some words out of something that is all words. And that limits what you can do both ways. There's no soundtrack in a novel. So having done that, I think the only question you can ask, and it's your choice whether you want to sell film or television rights, you can choose that. And the only thing you can really choose is, am I giving this to the right person? And sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes you think the answer is yes, and it is not yes. But all art is gambling, and that's gambling too.
Clement, what do you think an author deserves from filmmakers when the filmmaker takes on the challenge of adapting a book?
For me, I'm always trying to honor the writer. You know, I've done it a few times now. I'm currently in post-production on a film called Brother, which is written by an esteemed writer named David Teriandi. You know, when I read that novel, David's novel, and when I read Larry's novel, my first thought was, first of all, I was very deeply moved by both novels. And when I met with the authors, I wanted to really honor them, honor what they wrote. But at the same time, for me, I'm always trying to figure out how do I find myself in that novel? How do I make it personal in some way? You know, for me to spend 2-3 years trying to make it happen. In the case of Brother, which I just did, which is fresh in my mind, David wrote the story about, you know, it was very similar to my story. It's an immigrant story. It's about a family from Trinidad that they came to Canada in the 70s, 80s, and I came to Canada in the 70s and late 70s. But the difference between David's novel and my story is that his family came from Trinidad and my family came from Jamaica. And I remember when I met David, I remember thinking, you know, I have to figure out my way in. I have to, you know, I said to him, look, Trinidad and Jamaica are like cousins, but I would feel it more if the family was from Jamaica. And David laughed and said, absolutely, you know. You know, it's yours now. A novel is one thing, and the film is going to be yours. And you know, he gave me his blessings, and I sent him a couple of drafts, and he gave me some notes, and that was it. With Larry, it was a very different experience. With Larry, he was very intimate. You know, I worked with Larry closely. He was a great resource. He spent years researching that novel, and so he was my co-writer on it. He was my collaborator on it. He came with us to South Africa. He came with us to Nova Scotia. He traveled with us on when this series came out. So David was you know, said basically go with God, and Larry was on my right hand the whole time.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the way that you worked with Larry Hill, on that adaptation, because it's kind of fascinating. I've done a great deal of reading about the work that you did with him and the talking. And he said, writers don't like to talk. Novelists don't want to talk. So I want to talk a little bit more about that,
Absolutely.
but we'll get to that when we get to sort of the nuts and bolts of all of this. Sarah, you were 17 when you tried to option the rights to Alias Grace. What was it about that book that grabbed you then and then kept you interested for years afterward?
I mean, I kind of think that I didn't know. I was just so compelled by it. And I think that the mystery of its hold on me was what grabbed me, that there were clearly things that it was keying into and opening up in me that were things I needed to explore. I think it probably took me 20 years to unpack, and I probably didn't get to the end of it. And in a way, I'm only interested in adapting things where I have this kind of subconscious problem with, you know, like there's something in it that's haunting me and that I haven't figured out, but it's opening up a question that I have in life or about my existence. And I just need to go deeper into that question. So I think that's where obsession comes from. I think you can be interested in adapting something and be able to explain why, but I think that's probably not the right thing to adapt. I think it's the things that have a hold on you that you can't explain, where you can find yourself or a space between you and the work that's important to sort of unpack. And that's where I think the film is.
And when Margaret Atwood said no to you when you were 17, tell me about your reaction when that happened. Did you expect for her to say yes? You must have, or you wouldn't have approached her.
I remain enraged. No. No, I mean,
Yeah.
I think, you probably need to let 10 years pass before you look back and go, oh, right, I probably wouldn't option my novel to a 17-year-old either. Might not be my first choice. But I think it was good. It gave me so much time to think about it. And there were so many different iterations of Alias Grace that I almost got to be part of. So for a while, Working Title held the rights. And I was sort of chasing it around, applying for the job wherever I could. And then I got hired by Working Title to write it and direct it. And then they just stopped returning my calls suddenly. And they and then I sort of tracked it sneakily and like watched for the rights to lapse. And then at that point I was in my 30s and then could kind of reapply with some actual credits to Margaret. So it ended up being really good because the film, like the thing I would have written at 17 was totally different than in my 30s when I had some insight about why it was so compelling to me. And I think a lot of it for me was this idea of, is someone telling the truth about themselves? Do they know the truth about themselves? And the ambiguity that runs through it, and the lack of a landing on an answer, but the deep exploration of those questions.
Now, Emma, you come at this from a slightly different point of view. You've often said many times that you wrote the screenplay for Room before you even had the novel published. How did you prepare to write the screenplay? Did you buy a handbook? Did you buy a guide? Had you written screenplays before? Tell me about walking into that situation.
No, I didn't buy one because I imagined that the truth, if there was any truth in these books, would be found somewhere between them all. So I went to the university library here at Western and borrowed about 20, and really steeped myself in the genre and learned all the rules. But then the great thing was that when I finally ended up writing and rewriting the screenplay for Room, working closely with our director, Lenny Abrahamson, he let me drop a lot of the rules. He gave me permission because he was an actual film director. He was able to say, that one's not a rule, or that one doesn't matter, drop that one. So as with many converts or newbies, I was being too strict about the rules. But I think it was really important to teach myself that this was not a novel, this was a different kind of writing, and to approach it in a spirit of, wide-eyed enthusiasm for figuring out what makes this particular form of magic work. As Margaret said, it's mostly pictures, so it's deeply fundamentally different from novels, say. But yeah, I found a lot of good advice in other people's books, and I picked the brains of everyone I talked to. And above all, I learned a huge amount of working with my director. I think that screenwriter-director relationship, if it works well, if you sell your book to the right person, if you decide to write the screenplay with the right person, I think it could be a magically close relationship. And he sat at my kitchen table, and we literally mulled over scenes together and tried to bring them to life, and using the full toolbox of both our art forms.
And Margaret, you've done both. You've written screenplays. What was your entryway into writing screenplays?
Well, here's my entryway. I was living in Edmonton, Alberta, back before it was a phone on the wall. Remember those? No, you don't, you're too young.
I do.
Phone on the wall rings, and this boy says, "Oh, this is Oscar Lowenstein calling from London, England. I'm a film producer, and we would like to make a film of your novel, The Edible Woman." And I said, "Okay, who is this really?" Oh, I actually am Oscar Lowenstein. He really was Oscar Lowenstein, who produced Tom Jones, among others. Mm-hmm. And he had got hold of John Kemeny, who was later to make that cult film Quest for Fire. Remember it? So John Kemeny, one of the people who had gotten out of Hungary in 1956, and there's a whole community of people like that in Canada. So he and Oscar had come together, and they had got this young Hungarian director who was going to be the director, and they wanted me to write the screenplay. And I said, "But I'm not a screenplay writer." "Oh, that's all right. We'll teach you." Oh, no, I really think you need somebody who's a professional. Oh, no, we don't want some broken down hack from Hollywood. Translate, you'll be cheaper. So that got going, and I was working with this director who was very Hungarian, so everything was going to be purple and red, and he would say things like, Margaret, we have never seen a naked woman wrapped in cellophane before. We must have a naked woman wrapped in cellophane. So that was a screenplay of a certain kind, but then those two had a falling out, and it ended up with Oscar Lowenstein and Tony Richardson, who had directed Tom Jones and many others. And there I was working with Tony, and that screenplay was completely different. It was much more like a nut bar English comedy. Okay, so that was a really close education in how you can take one book and make either this out of it, or on the other hand, this other thing, which is nothing like it.
Mhm.
Very, very instructive. It didn't get made, but nonetheless.
And what was your reaction at the time when you saw this second, English sex farce version of the script?
Oh, I was just quite riveted. So, and shortly after that, I did a television play of the Alias Grace story. I hadn't yet written the novel, but I had been immersed in the story already, and had put it into suite of poems that I had written. So I did it was black and white television. It was 4 novelists who got hired by the CBC to write 1-hour plays. And I hadn't done all of the research that I was later to do. So that iteration of the Grace Mark story was very different from what finally came out.
And Clement, Emma mentioned the rules, learning some rules about writing a script and things. Are there rules? Are there, as you're writing, do you have a set of guidelines that you use?
I do. I mean, I tend to want to try to figure out how to get you to turn that page. like most writers, you're just trying to figure out how do you set up a mystery, like Sarah said. How do you set up a mystery and a question, and get the audience to turn the page? In terms of a novel, trying to adapt a novel, it's already been said that it's really, as a filmmaker, you have 2 things you're working with. You're working with images and you're working with sound. And oftentimes you're trying to figure out how to communicate the emotional details of the novel with those 2 things, and oftentimes you're, at least for me, when I'm trying to work on a screenplay and trying to figure out how do I communicate what the character's feeling is always about behavior, because I find for me, I'm trying to figure out how do I reveal the character through their behavior, through images. But in terms of rules, something has to happen every few pages. I have about 5 or 6 sort of events that I'm working towards, and I'm trying to be as economical, and I'm trying to be as suspenseful to get to those moments as I can. So those are the only rules that I've followed, and really to try to give you the inevitable surprise at the end. You think you know what the end is going to be, but it's satisfying, but it's a surprise. Those are the rules I follow.
That's great. You should write a novel.
Sarah, following on what Clement just said, my favorite scenes in films are scenes where there is no or very little dialogue, but you learn everything you need to know about the character. And I can think of a few of them off the top of my head. In Lost in Translation, when Scarlett Johansson puts her head on Bill Murray's shoulder, at one point you learn everything you need to know about the relationship they're in that moment, and they don't say a word in that scene, and it's a really lovely moment. When you're writing something like that, do you visualize it? Do you see the pictures, or how does it work for your process?
I do now. I think that's evolved for me. Like I didn't start off, I think, as a visual filmmaker. I think that's something that's grown in me. So it's become more and more about the visuals. It was something I had to work. I was more about the words, and I've worked towards that. But I think for me, a really important starting point now is after I read a book for the first time, if I know I'm adapting it, is before I go and do the deep dive into the granular, making sure I've missed nothing and making sure I understand everything. I try to sort of create an outline off the top of my head of what I think I read and what the most important images to me are that made me think it was a film, so that those images go up on a board and they're the ones that I have absolute fidelity to, or the ones that after that first read, I saw these images and they must remain there for that reason. And what's really interesting is I'm finding now more and more that occasionally there's an image that felt seminal to me that couldn't be missed. That's actually not in the book. That's like the thing, that's your interpretation or something you've funneled or mapped your own life onto or your own aesthetic onto that actually wasn't an image from the book, but you've sort of put it on top of another image that is there. And I think it's really interesting then to decide, do you create the image that was in the book, or do you create your interpretation of what that moment was? So for me now, it's more important than ever that those visual moments begin the process of creating what the adaptation is.
Francois Truffaut said, here's another quote, that what I do is read a story only once, and if I like the basic idea, I just forget all about the book and start to create cinema.
What a jerk. Read the book, buddy.
One of the big surprises to me was Night of the Hunter, which is a film I like a lot.
Mhm.
I thought that some of those images must have been made by the filmmakers.
Right.
So I went back and read the book, and they're in the book.
Right.
Actually,
The love and hate tattoos.
Love and hate.
and the owl
Owl.
image, I thought they put that owl in, but no, it's actually in the book.
And what about Shelley Winters in the car at the bottom of the ocean?
Love
Bottom of the
Shelley Winters in the car at the bottom of the line. Shelley Winters. Yes, I think it's a very beautifully made film, partly because the director, who is Charles Laughton, was a painting collector. He collected paintings, and if you look at each of those scenes, you can see that it's framed like a painting.
Emma, you have adapted your own work. So how is the process different for you, perhaps, because you have those images, you know what you were thinking, and you come at it from a different point of view?
You're still starting all over again, though. You know, there's absolutely no point saying, oh, I know what this scene should be and I wrote it in the novel. No, that's no good to you. You have to start again and say, how do I tell this story and capture the spirit of it, but using light and faces primarily. So just, it's so different. You have to approach it as if you're a new person now, you're the screenwriter. And if you don't have a huge enthusiasm for the special strengths of cinema and television, then, you know, don't take the gig. I remember a journalist saying to me, like, what percentage do you think you managed to keep? I was like, that's an accountant's question, you know, that's not a screenwriting question. I've seen films where they tick all the boxes of each scene and somehow none of the spirit of it is translated. I would say that the film of The Time Traveler's Wife, for instance, I was like, where did the book go? And I've seen films that are much looser adaptations, but they do capture the feel. So yeah, even if it's your own book, you can't be approaching it with an accountancy mindset. You know, for instance, when I was starting Room, I remember thinking I need to start it with some visual image that gives us the child's mindset in that room, not where the book starts. So I plucked out a tiny little moment for about a quarter of the way into the book where he notices his mother flashing a light at the skylight in the middle of the night. And it's a disturbing, peculiar visual image. And I was like, okay, that's where we begin, because this is cinema. So totally different business. So in a way, having written the novel doesn't particularly help. You know, I'm sure there are moments where it hinders and where you have to let the director say to you, we don't need that bit, let that bit go.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily have more fidelity to the book because you wrote the book as well.
No, I wouldn't say so. Above all, you don't have the final say. You know, a writer's powers are limited within a film. You're subordinate in a way you're really not when it's fiction, and even not as much when it's theatre. So I feel when I'm on a film set in particular, at that point I have no power left, but I'm so enjoying the process. But if you're not willing to sort of give up a lot of your power, but really enjoy the collaboration, then again, don't take the gig. You know, I happen to really enjoy it. It's a great contrast with fiction, where you're, you know, the lonely queen of this realm with nobody to talk to. You know, in film world, I feel like, okay, it's not in any way in my control anymore. There's so many different variables, from, you know, the director's decisions through to a line that the cast just improvised, through to the budget, but it's all enormous fun.
Well, Clement,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, it's sometimes enormous fun. It's a lot like summer camp. So if the weather's great and you like the people. If the weather's terrible and you're people commuting all the time, then it's not. And I've done both.
Yeah. Well, let's talk,
You,
Margaret.
Sarah, not you. You were great.
Let's talk a little bit about The Handmaid's Tale. It was trending on Twitter earlier today for reasons that are outside of the adaptation. We can talk about that if you want. But tell me a little bit about what your involvement with that show has been like, and what has it been like for you to see it develop over each successive season?
Well, first of all, I got lucky, and not everybody does. So this could have been a really terrible show. It had all the potential to be absolutely awful, and you can imagine. Well, I'm not going to make you imagine. So there was with a different company that I thought, they can't do this. You cannot have women going into the resistance with their machine guns, but without their tops on. You cannot do that. It wouldn't happen in real life, and it ought not to happen in an adaptation of this particular book. So that didn't happen, and then luckily, we got Bruce Miller, who again was he fell in love with the book as a teenager, and I think a lot of the films that people make when they grow up have been things that they fell in love with as teenagers, when they had the ability and the connections, they were able to make them. So he talked himself into the job because he was so thoroughly immersed in the novel. He had wanted to do this ever since he was 19, and he took a lot of care. So that part has been great. They obeyed one of the central premises of the book, which is you don't put anything into this that hasn't happened sometime somewhere. So they've been faithful to that, and they've also been very dedicated as a team. So the actors, the directors, the designers, they've all taken it very seriously, and I think it happened at a time in history when it was possible to take it seriously. Whereas with the first film, which came out in 1989, I'm not sure that we were at a moment where we believed in this as a possibility, unless we already had some knowledge of cult practices in the United States. And that film was made by Europeans, essentially.
And written by Harold Pinter, right? The screenplay?
Yes, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Was it? I'm sensing.
Kind of way.
Well, I like what you say here about having input on the show, and you say I've done some yelling, but it was fairly effective yelling. So is it a situation where you have to choose your moments when to put your foot down?
Well, surely we do that in real life anyway.
Mm.
We don't just yell all the time. At least I don't.
You haven't been on the subway recently.
Yes, I have.
Oh,
Yes, I have, but nobody was yelling. So me yelling is you might not notice. I don't actually yell, but I can glare.
Right.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So only a couple of things, and this would be conversations with Bruce, in which, because I get the scripts and I make notes on them, etc. But as Emma says, you don't have any power. You don't have any actual power. You might have you might have a bit of influence, but you don't have power. So I did say, you're not allowed to kill Aunt Lydia. And Bruce said, well, I wasn't going to really anyway. And I also said, hands off that baby.
And Clement, Molly Johnson convinced you to read the Book of Negroes. You hadn't read it at that point. It had been out for a little while. She bumped into you at a bookstore somewhere, and from what I understand, put a copy of it in your hand and said, you have to read this. So when did it become apparent to you that this was a project that was going to stick, that was something that you wanted to work on and invest in any of these situations? You're investing years of your life into it. So it has to be something that you want to live with for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, with Larry's book, and Larry knows this, I didn't really want to read the novel because of the title. I had a kind of bias and a kind of an assumption about what it was. But when I ran into Molly at the same the Rosedale Library, which is no more, which is no more. She really kind of convinced me, and she basically took my credit card out of my pocket and forced me to buy it, which I did. And even then, I kind of brought it home and sat on my on my shelf for forever. And then one day I just picked it up and I started reading it, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the kind of world and this character that Larry created, and wanted to go on that journey with her. He somehow made an action adventure, badass, woman, smart, character that I wanted to see what happened to her and invested in her, and so once I fell in love with the character, and then I had to convince Larry that I was the right person to do it. It's about a woman. I'm a man trying to make this story about. He wrote this novel, but I drove out to his house. We had dinner, and I said, "Look, he said, why should I give you this rights to my novel?" And I said, it's personal. She has that same spirit that that my mom had, that I somehow see in my mother, and I see it as kind of like the Wizard of Oz. She's this woman who's in Africa. She's taken, she's like Dorothy. She's taken from Africa. She's put on this road, and all she wants to do is get back to Africa. All she wants to do is get back home. It's a simple, classic story. It's very Greek that way. And so after a moment, he looked at me and paused and said, "Okay, like Margaret, Atwood said, maybe you're the right person." And we had a great time, and I spent a long time trying to make it as a feature film. I shopped it around, and no one wanted to make a story about a slave narrative. Nobody did. And then we thought, okay, let's try to make it into a miniseries. And the CBC, we pitched it to the CBC. The CBC agreed. I wanted Larry with me the whole time. I wanted him as part of the process, and he was my partner on it. All the way through.
How daunting was that when you had a script for a feature, which was 100 pages long, 120 pages long, and now you say, okay, well, we can rework this, but it changes the shape of the story. It changes everything when you are turning it in from an hour and a half or 2 hours into something that is 6 or 8 hours long. How daunting was that at the beginning, or did you already have sort of a plan in your head?
We had a plan in our heads, because the way Larry structured his novel, Aminata kind of traveled, and she was, she's in Africa, and then she's in, South Carolina, and then she ends up in Washington, and then she ends up in Nova Scotia, and then she ends up in London. And so we really kind of structured in New York. So we sort of structured the story around these places, and we gave ourselves the rules that each episode would encompass a location.
Mhm.
And he was invaluable in helping me and help us sort of craft and structure this story. There's things that that are in a novel that are not a part of the series. And I remember, this is a sort of spoiler alert for anyone who's out there. One of the character in the novels, Shakura, dies off screen, dies, off screen, essentially, in the novel. I said, Larry, if an audience invests 6 episodes into this character, you pretty much have to kill him on screen. and so
That's one of the rules.
That's one of the rules. Somehow you will, if you somehow emotionally get invested in this character, and he smiled and he agreed. So like little things like that. And research, he was such a, he spent years researching. So any questions I had around the period, around that history, Larry knew inside out, because he had traveled to those places, he had researched it, he was steeped in that history.
Sarah, what are some of the features of books that lend themselves to television and film adaptations? Are there features of narrative or style or structure that seem better suited to be adapted for the screen than others?
I'm not sure, because I think it's so instinctual, because I've seen people make great films out of books that I thought were completely unadaptable. And I've seen movies that don't work at all out of books that seem like they're halfway to a screenplay already. So I think there's no rules. I think it's about how much a filmmaker is passionate about adapting something and walking around inside a book for a few years. I really think it's about somebody being able to see something because they're bringing so much of themselves to the material. So I don't think there's a rule. I just think I really have seen miracles happen where, a book that was easily dismissed as unadaptable has, been great, and vice versa. So I just think it's about the sort of passion and investment and the skill rather than what it is.
As an actor, and you don't have to name names unless you want to, but were you ever offered a script of a book that you loved, but the script wasn't good and you were torn because, like, you're nodding, it looks like
Absolutely.
That has to
and
be
it's painful because you go, but this, or your favorite moments of a character aren't there or have been misinterpreted, or I've seen that happen so many times, and it's agonizing, especially if it's a book you love, to see and to know it's happened, to know that the train is in motion. It's almost worse than seeing the final product. It's like watching a slow moving train crash. You're like, no, not with that book. But yeah, I mean, but then again, I've been wrong. I've read scripts I didn't think worked at all, and in the hands of the right filmmaker. I think it's not a process that I think has a lot you can depend on. I think I really have seen messy scripts become great films in the hands of a filmmaker where no one could intuit what they were going to do with it. Nobody knows how that filmmaker works. And again, like perfect scripts that are just disasters. Like it sometimes I think a film is heavily dependent on a great script, and sometimes it isn't. It's so hard to pin down this process. And I think that financiers spend a lot of time trying to figure out the formula, and it doesn't have one.
Yeah, I think filmmaking is a weird kind of alchemy. You could be in a moment and suddenly, I've had wonderful scenes that were shot in 5 minutes because the sun was going down, and you had to get it in that moment. So you're not thinking, you're just operating on pure instincts, and then it becomes one of the most beautiful, moment in the film. It's amazing.
And that comes from confidence, though, because probably on your first film, you might not have the instinct or the confidence to do that. That's something that comes with having done it for a while, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, the more films I make, the more I trust my instincts. I'm sure, like a lot of artists, the more you do, the more you kind of trust that your instrument. And so, yes, there have been moments where I've walked on the set and I did not know what I was going to do, and it's scary.
Yeah.
But you have two actors there, and the act, and then the performer will give you something, and something that you've never thought about, and it's like a miracle in front of you. It happens all the time. It's a weird mixture of magic and alchemy, and light and shadow, and the perfect dolly move as the actor lifts their head and the tear drop. It's like poetry sometimes.
Emma, there must have been those moments as Room was being made, as someone who knew the story so well and had lived with it as a novel, then as a screenplay. As the film was being made, were there moments that you hadn't imagined that turned out much differently than you might have thought they would originally?
Oh, so many, yes. And especially because we were working with a very young child, Jacob Tremblay.
Yeah.
A lot of his dialogue was improvised along the lines of what the director was feeding to him. The director was mostly lying down in the bath or under the floorboards in that tiny space. So he'd be chatting away to Jake, giving him the gist of his lines, and then Jake would produce that in his own kind of idiom. So a lot was semi-improvised. And one lovely surprise to me was there were moments when the dialogue ended up being stripped away and it didn't matter. It's as if the dialogue had soaked into the scene such that you didn't need to hear the words anymore. There was this scene I had carefully written where the mother and child are in the bath and she's telling him this particular fairy tale, which, is a perfect backdrop to the plot of the story. And, what we saw in the final edit was them splashing each other in the bath, no dialogue at all, and it worked perfectly. So that doesn't tell me that you shouldn't put the words in the first place, but it does mean that certainly there are times when you should take all the words out by the time you're finished. but the words have helped. Maybe the words have told the actors how to be. Right. Maybe they've told the director how to move the camera. But yeah, sometimes the words can go in the end.
There was an author that was recently wrote a piece in the New York Times about seeing a film version of one of his novels. And he wrote that it was like seeing a strange dream version of his book. Margaret, what's it like to watch an adaptation of your own work?
Well, it depends on the adaptation, doesn't it? So let's talk about Sarah's. I think Sarah did brilliantly. But we had a lot of conversations before she even started. She really wanted me to tell her whether Grace Marks was a murderer or not. And I couldn't because nobody ever knew. It was never, so 4 people were in a house, and within a few months, 3 of them were dead. There's only 1 left. And she certainly never told. So that's reality, because this was based on a true story, just like Larry Hill's book was all based on true stuff that happened.
Yeah.
So we hung in there, and that Alias Grace was postponed for years because of some horrifying events that happened to Sarah, which she's put into her memoir called Running to the Danger. And we held it for her because we, again, we thought this is the right person. So go with the one that loves you. And she was very heavily invested, and it shows in the choices that were made in making the series. And I have to say at this point that the invention of the miniseries and the invention of the streamed television series has been a boon to novelists, especially novelists of some amplitude. Like, I don't know how you ever could have got Book of Negroes into 90 minutes. It's too big.
Yes.
There's too much of it. So that's been very lucky for writers of novels, especially longer novels. I mean, War and Peace, 90 minutes, forget it.
Sarah, why was it important for you to know something that wasn't in the book in that sense?
I mean, I just wanted to know everything.
To know everything.
I want to know everything. And Margaret is sort of unusually generous with her time. I mean, you don't get that amount of time with a novelist, but I I wanted to know everything I could. I wanted to capture the book as well as I could. I knew that there were details that were described in the book that I would have to make visual. And so there's a certain translation process in that. And I think for me, the most interesting thing, I mean, first of all, if you are in love with a book, getting to sit with the person who wrote it for many hours and get to ask them every question you want to is, as a reader, it's everyone's dream. If you love reading books, getting to sit with a writer and talk to them for days about their book, there's just no greater experience in the world. And my favorite question to ask of a writer, if I'm adapting their work, is, what's the most important thing to you about this as a film? If there's one thing that's most important, what is it? And that's always so interesting and surprising. And it's usually at the tip of their tongue, right, what that thing is. And with Margaret, it has to remain ambiguous. We don't know, and we can't know.
I would imagine that it's always, or not always, obvious either. The thing that's most important to the writer.
I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Like Miriam Taves I just adopted Women Talking. And I think one of the things she said was the humor. They have to laugh. These women have to laugh. And, that isn't something that would have been on my radar as a priority, but you better be ready if you ask that question to make it your priority, whatever the answer is, once you've asked the question. But it really does, it acts as a kind of anchor in the process of knowing that even if lots of things change, that there is a fidelity to the book.
Yeah.
We are about halfway through, and I just want to remind everyone that's watching, if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little Q&A button. If you have a question for any of our panelists, write it in there. I'll get it over here, and eventually we're going to get to as many of those as we can. There's already quite a few here, so I'll try and get to as many as I can. Now I think we should probably get into, I guess, more of the kind of nuts and bolts of how this process works, this adaptation process works. So Emma, tell me a little bit about writing this. The novel is told entirely from the point of view of a 5-year-old. How did you find the cinematic equivalent of that technique?
Yeah, because as you say, Richard, it can't be the same thing. A film can't be shot from inside somebody's brain. Even if you put a GoPro camera on their head, that's not the same thing. So you have to find equivalents. So I knew in a way that even if we had Jack in every single scene, that it would effectively be a film about him and his mother much more equally than the book, which is purely his. So I thought, great, Ma will get a chance to shine. And all those readers have written to me saying, tell us more about what it was like for Ma. In a way, she gets to step forward and be the sort of equal hero of the film. But apart from that, I would say we did remarkably, to a remarkable degree, follow the book in staying loyal to the child. I think far more conventional filmmakers would have said, oh, let's cut away to what the psychopath is doing. There are all those conventions about the interesting psychopath going to the hardware store. And, we just banned all that. We were resolutely uninterested in the villain. We prioritized, like Sarah was saying, you have to remember what are these key things to hold on to. It's so easy to lose your way in the film process in a massive detail. So it's great to have certain priorities like, keep Grace ambiguous, or don't kill Aunt Lydia. So in our case, it was always, this is a film about love between mother and child. So don't be distracted by the crime trappings. And I would say, when you were asking, Richard, what are the qualities of books that work well on screen? Of course, it can be any kind of book, but I would say in my case, I found that my works, which have a plot you can tell while you're riding in an elevator, that does help. It doesn't have to be a facile plot, but it helps if you can say what the book is about in terms of making that translation, because otherwise it is possible to get very lost. Whereas if I find myself describing a book as like, ooh, it's a subtle study of, or it's set in the world of, if I can't use active verbs in saying what it's about, I don't think it's very likely to survive that complex translation process.
Right. Now, I'm going to take a question from Cora Siri here. And Margaret, let's go to you with this. What are some, wait, no. I'll go to a question from Monique Hendrickson first. How much behavior should you write into a script? What is too much and what is too little? And that's probably different for every single thing that you touch, but what would you say to that?
Well, usually you're working with a director. where you're working with a team, you're working with other people. And in this, as Emma said, it's quite unlike writing a novel. And it is much more like sitting around a table, sort of tossing ideas here and there. And when I was working with Tony Richardson, he would say, so we need a scene here, which is got to be outside. And I would like to see these people doing that. Go and write the scene. So I'd go off and write the scene. A couple of naked people would run through the room. There was only one room that had an electrical plug. This was at an enclave in the south of France, which had once been a village that Tony Richardson had purchased from Jean Moreau.
Wow.
Where were the people? What happened to the people who used to live in the village? And he said, they intermurdered each other. There was only the electricity in the one room, so that's where my electric typewriter was, and everybody went back and forth all the time. Anyway, that's a distraction. What was the question? You were wondering
how much behavior, when you're writing into a script, how much behavior is too much behavior? What do you know? What to leave out? What to leave in?
Well, you don't know, but different screenwriters have different styles, and some of them put in quite a lot. And some of them even put in what they would like us to be thinking about this scene. So they're quite detailed, and others are quite minimalist. Like, here's the shot, here's what we're seeing, here's what they say, and the rest is up to the actors and the director and the film editor. And you know what they say about those. That's where the film is really made. So it's a matter of personal style. And I think it also depends on whether you're writing it cold and intending to pitch it to somebody, or whether you're already working with a team. So if you're already working with the team, you're going to get a lot of not exactly direction, but requests and preferences from them. So how do we know that this person is angry? Give us more. Or we already know that, leave that out.
And Sarah and Clement, you're the two writer-directors on the panel. Do either of you storyboard in your head when you write an adaptation? Do you put in shots? Here's an area. I think you mentioned this earlier, Sarah. You're sort of starting to do that more. Clement, do you do that? Is that something, as you're writing, you're thinking of what it's going to look like ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you call me a writer-director, but I find that as a writer, all I'm trying to do is put what I see down on paper in the most economical way that I can. So it's always, for me, it's always about imagery. And, for me, I have a hard time writing dialogue. So I don't write dialogue unless I absolutely have to. Because I just find it much easier to describe a scene, describe the behavior, describe the light and shadow, as opposed to, I find it tough. You'll find very few, 3 or 4 or 5 page scenes in my movies, because I find like people sitting in a room talking is, to me, the least interesting thing for me. It's always, oftentimes I write those scenes, and like Emma said, you just cut those scenes, you cut all the dialogue out, and you just have, somebody walks in, look at that person, they kind of, look away, and then they walk out of the room, and that's a scene.
Yeah.
So to answer your questions, for me, it always starts with the imagery. It always starts with how one image connects to the next, all the way until the climax.
Well, Lawrence Hill said that he was on set with you during the making of Book of Negroes, and you would say, we need a line. Give me a line here. and he would have to sort of off the top of his head in the moment come up with some dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted Larry there, because I'm a terrible at writing a dialogue. So in a moment where I feel like I need a bridge for this, from one moment to the next, and if Larry's there, it's like, okay, Larry, in between takes, what would they say? You give me something, and of course he's just pops it. He's a very skilled that way. He would just come up with it within seconds, and then I'll give it to the actor, and that that would be the line. So,
Sarah, how complete do you work that way? How much fidelity do you have to the script that you've written when you're on set as a director?
I think quite a bit. I mean, I usually have a rehearsal process, so things shift in rehearsal for sure. And every now and then, if a line isn't working, we'll shift it on set. But in general, throughout, a long meetings with actors and then rehearsal process, we usually work out any dialogue shifts in there. Like I'm getting better at thinking on my feet. But that was something that would have terrified me before. So I think it's taken me a few films to kind of go, okay, this isn't working. What can we do? And be willing to make that shift. But that is something that for me has taken some experience to come to. And
was it a question of finishing the film and seeing it and going, man, I wish I had, had the courage or the wherewithal or whatever it is to say in the moment when we were shooting that doesn't work?
I think it's also getting older and getting comfortable with the idea of people watching you in a silent moment where you don't know something. Right. I think that's just an age thing. You're just like, I don't know what I'm doing at this moment. Hopefully I will in a few minutes. Like that for me is just taken getting to my 40s to be okay with.
Right. Another question from St. John's. They're thanking you for the wonderful session. We'd like to know, and maybe I'll throw this out to everyone. What are some adaptations that the panelists admire? Is there an adaptation of a book into film that stands out for you?
Okay, I already said Night of the Hunter, but I'll say Maltese Falcon.
You are talking my language now, Margaret.
What did you want, black and white?
Yes, well, look at me, of course, yeah. I like older movies, so TCM is always on over here. Clement, do you have an adaptation that sticks out?
I'm a big Michael Indati fan, and I really love The English Patient.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a brilliant work. And I love Coming Through Slaughter. It's one of my bucket lists. I'd love to see that one.
When are you gonna make that, Clement?
I don't know. When
you've been
when
talking about that for 20 years or so.
One of these days, Michael will say, "Okay, it's you."
Maybe everybody watching could write to Michael tonight.
Right.
Why hasn't he said that already? Did you ask him?
Oh, when we go to Emma.
Emma, do you have an adaptation?
I'm going to mention Brokeback Mountain because it comes up in one of the Q&A questions. I think Brokeback Mountain is a perfect example of where a short story can be the most amazing source for adaptation, because there's room for you to breathe and even breathe more. There's room for you to add in stuff that's necessary for the film rather than just translating chunks of text. So I think, a film like that manages to actually expand on what's already so evocatively there in the story. That's probably a far better enterprise than taking something enormously complicated and desperately trying to wrestle it into an hour and a half.
And Sarah?
The two that come to mind immediately for me, which are two of my favorite films of all time, are There Will Be Blood and The Thin Red Line. And, in the case of The Thin Red Line and also There Will Be Blood, the adaptations are so far actually from the book. Like, I mean, it's its own, but there's something in the spirit of the book that it's so true to.
Can I throw in a cult film?
Absolutely.
I don't know whether there was a book that it was based on. Are you going to be shocked if I say Night of the Living Dead?
There was not a book that it was based on. I know that for sure, but it's been written as a book since. So it's a backwards thing, but Night of the Living.
So really wow. Something with like no money.
Yeah.
Out of nowhere, unknown actors, and it's perfectly constructed.
and has one of the greatest lines. "They're coming to get you, Barbara," is one of the greatest lines in a horror film, like maybe ever. Let's look at it now. Let's go to Emma. And this is something that I don't know that you've used, but Deirdre Dwyer wants to know, do you like voiceovers as imparting the novel's narrator's thoughts? And that actually she would ask to all of you.
I'm really wary of them, especially if it's an adaptation of a literary novel, because so often the voiceover is used as some kind of, endorsement, like, this is literary, listen, you can hear a chunk of the book. So I'm extremely wary of them. And I didn't want to use one in Room at all, but the director persuaded me that there were moments when it would be useful linking between sections. But he said, look, write me voiceover that does not neatly map onto the action we're seeing. So we'll have a lovely kind of mismatch or gap between the child's thoughts and the child's actions. Don't just, show him playing with his mother and then have him say that he loves his mother. Don't make it obvious. So I think voiceover should be used, critically and sparingly, basically, not as some kind of big comforting emotional band-aid.
Clement, do you use voiceover?
I haven't, but some of my favorite films have a voiceover. A film that immediately comes to mind is Apocalypse Now.
Yeah,
which is a Joseph Conrad's novel. And so yeah, films like Taxi Driver, Apocalypse Now, Badlands. Terrence Malick is the best at voiceover. When it's done well, it's incredible. I haven't been able. Every time I've attempted it, I've always just cut it out of my movies.
But you have tried it.
I've tried it, but I've never been successful at it. It always feels false. It doesn't feel, like Terrence Malick feels like he's whispering to you or something. Like it's just very intimate. There's a kind of intimacy, and it's like the voiceover is talking specifically to you. I mean, Sarah mentioned the Thin Red Line. Yeah. This probably has some of the best voiceover ever in cinema.
I think Badlands for me Badlands is a film that I think if you took the narration out, you would have obviously a much different film, but a much lesser film. Yeah. And I used to not be a fan of too much narration, because I thought it was just too easy a way to push the story along, until I saw Badlands again. And I was like, well, Terrence Malick, that guy, he's got a future. He knows what he's doing.
I'll tell you a cautionary tale.
Oh.
A cautionary tale. Harold Pinter wrote voiceover for his screenplay of The Handmaid's Tale. And Natasha Richardson recorded it and played against it, because she's in a situation in which she's not supposed to reveal any emotion, but she has these thoughts about what's going on. And the voiceover was her thoughts. And then the director took the voiceover out.
Oh no.
Left her performance feeling quite flat.
Yeah.
The power of it was the fact that she wasn't reacting. She was very carefully not reacting, but she was reacting inside. So in the Handmaid's Tale second iteration streamed series, they put it back in.
Clement Marianne Ward on the Q&A board says, here's hoping you can adapt Coming Through Slaughter, such a beautiful poetic novels. Her fingers are crossed for you. Yes. So we've started that ball rolling.
Thank you.
Let's take another one here. Emma, this is from Margaret Sinclair, and she says, I'm wondering how Emma would compare the experience of working on the stage play with the film adaptation of Room. And she adds, I saw the play recently and thought it was very well done, especially the musical thoughts, she says.
Yeah, I suppose I'm one of those lucky authors who's been able to try a story of hers in 3 forms. And far from it being one like triple-decker ego trip, it doesn't leave me with this feeling of like, wow, my story is so timeless. It's more like I'm left with a huge respect for what fiction can do and what cinema is and what theater is. Because in each case, I've not only noticed the difference differences and the different experience of working with different people in the two very collaborative forms, whereas working solo alone. But also, I've really tried to lean into what's strong about that particular genre. So in the case of Room, the play, because we'd done the film already, we thought, well, the film, was so good at naturalism. A play is going to be not as good at capturing, that. And so let's lean into the theatricality. So the play has songs, it has a revolving set, it has animations of Jack's drawings. So the whole thing is far less, realistic, but far more focused on the kind of, magic of two prisoners locked up trying to distract themselves from their imprisonment. So yeah, for me, it's been a huge pleasure to kind of investigate the art form with the story I happen to have to tell, rather than be so focused on, the wonders of my story. And I would say film and TV, I've really enjoyed. My favorite place to work at all is probably a rehearsal room, because it's interactive, and yet the writer still has a huge amount of power within that room. Whereas in the film world, there are moments when you feel like such a loser because, you think of it as your film, and then the security guy tells you you can't walk down there because they're making a movie. And you're like, I know, it's fine. So you're very much on the fringes of things. And whereas in the rehearsal room, nobody forgets that you're important to the process, but everyone has such good ideas, and, actors are full of really helpful suggestions about their motivation. There's that cliche of the actor who's being obstructed by saying, what's my motivation? But I find it hugely helpful. So yeah, I probably enjoy the theater process most. And also theater, of course, costs a lot of money, but within the rehearsal room, nobody talks money. Everyone just focuses on, the glory of the art of theater. Whereas in the film world, that you do hear the money conversations more often. But on the other hand, film, at the point where you're bringing it to the public, film, you realize is all your friends care about. I always thought my friends were quite excited that I'd written novels, but no, compared to me going to the Oscars, I realized they had thought of me as having a very dull career all this time. It was only the film world that they were interested in, and specifically the, Hollywood publicity side of things. So, each of the forms has brought its pleasures, and it's been an amazing experience just getting to kind of, put one foot in.
Hendrik Sire would like to know, Margaret, I'll ask you this. Have actors ever approached you as the writer to clarify finer points of the role that they are playing?
Really short answer, no.
No. Well, Hendrik, I hope that's satisfying for you. Let's go back here through a couple of sort of fairly general questions that are just off topic a little bit. I mentioned Cora Syra earlier. She has a question here. What are some of the ways a published but unagented author can get their books noticed by a filmmaker / producer / director? Clement, would you accept an unsolicited manuscript?
I get contacted all the time by writers of novels or screenplays who are, looking to try to get it realized. And nowadays I'm much more careful, just to make sure that there is a kind of process that they need to go through.
There are legalities involved here,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
If 5 years from now you make a film that has a passing resemblance to that novel, then there's a lawsuit. Right?
Exactly. And so I'm much more, once upon a time I was much more open to that, but now, we just live in a world that's changed. And so I'm much more careful in what I read before, there has to be a kind of legal, some kind of process. But yeah, I'm always reading novels, I'm always, looking at the Giller long list. I'm always, on the CBC books to see, what's coming out, what's happening. That's how I found, I'm working with, I'm working on Half-Blood Blues right now as a miniseries, and when the Giller, I chased that novel for years, and then it's finally mine. So, so yeah, writers approach me all the time, yes.
Sarah, do people slip manuscripts to you at yoga class?
No.
Yeah, but I'm on average making a film every 10 years. So I don't think people are very hopeful that I'm going to make anything. I mean, I think in terms of advice, I would say it's probably really helpful when approaching people to, in the cover letter, give a really succinct description of what the plot is and what it is, just because I think that's the thing that will either grab someone's interest or not, and that's the thing they'll have time to read no matter what. So I think if you have a novel out there that you're putting forward on your own, just making sure that you describe it as well as possible and as an interesting a way as possible in that letter, I think is probably the best approach.
Emma, you must have had an agent, right, when Room was sold, or no?
A film agent, yes. And
Yeah.
actually, I found that, film agents really do know the film world in a way that literary agents generally don't. So yeah, that's very helpful. And one thing certainly that I did was I asked or rather my film agent said to me, look, what do you want? Do you want money as fast as possible, or do you want a real share in making this? Do you want not power, not control, but involvement? Right. And I said, actually, involvement is what I would love. So she said, okay, that's what I'll try and get you. So for Room and the Wonder, we did a really unusual attachment deal where no money was exchanged until just before the filming started, which meant that I risked not making anything at all. But on the other hand, I didn't risk losing the book to people who would fail to make a film of it. So it was a sort of agreed partnership, or kind of a dance, I suppose. We trusted each other and worked away on it on both sides without anyone having signed a contract. So this kind of attachment deal I have found to be a wonderful way to actually give myself more of a role in the development process than the writer would usually have. So I've never, sold my rights outright and just had them kind of taken away from me and me left wondering what's going on. I've only ever done this kind of negotiated dance,
This is from an anonymous attendee. How, in your view, and this is a question for anyone here on the panel, is the approach to adapting fiction different than approaching a biography or a memoir or something based on a true story? We hear this all the time in films will come out. There's lawsuits flying around a television show right now called Winning Time that's about the Lakers in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's based on real people, and a lot of the real people are still alive and they're not very happy at the way they're being played. How much responsibility, Clement, do you think a filmmaker owes to the subject if it's a biography or a memoir?
I've never done a biography of a living person, and that's on purpose, because it just feels like it would be a really thorny. It could be quite thorny. How do you depict someone's full life in 2 hours? How do you portray that? I mean, when it's done well, I'm always amazed at it. I just watched King Richard and thought, oh, that was a very sort of interesting. But could I have done it? I mean, I think I would do it, but I think the subject would have to understand that this is not a paint. I'm not creating a photograph. This is kind of like a sketch, a portrait in some way. It's not. And I don't think I could do a cradle to grave biography. I would, have to pick a moment or figure out a structure that would make sense for me. And I would want them as intimately as part of that process as possible, because so that they understand what that is. Because there's been lots of horror stories of people who are not happy with their final sort of portrait.
Margaret, when you watch a biography on film, are you expecting a documentary, or you're expecting to be that the filmmaker has taken dramatic license?
Well, it's hard to answer that. I've been the subject of several documentaries, and the first person who made one back in the late 70s, early 80s was an Australian filmmaker, and he talked me into it by saying, I'm not going to do the standard writer's biography. It's not going to be about your typewriter. It will not show you strolling down a leafy street with your dog. None of that. So I promise not to do that. He said, second, if you let me do this, nobody else will ask you for a long time. It's true. But the clincher was, he said,
That's him.
that's him.
He's mad.
He said, you'll be happy to have the footage of your parents, ... later. And
Wow.
all of those things that he said were true. He didn't make the pipe and the typewriter in the leafy streets. Nobody did ask me for a long time, and I am glad to have the footage of my parents later. So like that. So I think there's always more to it than just, are you happy with the portrait or any of that kind of thing. There's always a context around these things. But you're asking me if I were looking at the biography of somebody that I don't know at all.
Mhm.
So
Can I ask a
it would
question? Was
be-
that the one where you put the paper bag over your head and
Yes,
everyone's asking you, who is Margaret Atwood?
That's the one.
That's the funniest thing
That's
I've ever
funny.
seen in my whole life. They gave up trying to get answers out of her, sent her away with the camera.
He
She
had
put
the
a paper bag
idea,
over. It was
an
so
idea of
good.
what he wanted it to be, and it wasn't. So that's he was trying to make it some deep, dark, psychological weird thing. And I was trying to say, Charles Dickens may have been deep, dark, and weird, but he was also looking at the society out there.
Right.
There is a society out there. It's not just all in your head. So I think the funniest thing happened after he'd finished shooting. He was just dancing around doing a little happy dance, and he whacked his foot against a tree, and he said, I've broken my foot. And Graham said, walk down to the end of the dock and put your foot in the water. It's cooler down there. So he did. And Graham said, I just wanted to see if he could walk.
It's really worth seeing this documentary because it's like basically Margaret takes the camera away and has it for a night and then makes fun of him. And it's unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. It's so
Well,
good.
that's pretty
I-
desperate.
I will be doing a deep dive and looking for that one right after we're done here in a few minutes. This is from Patty Tasco, and this is for Margaret and Emma. Have you ever questioned a casting decision or thought it was a really terrible match for a character you created? It goes without saying you don't have to mention names, but I wonder if that is the case for you.
Short answer, yes.
Yes.
In my case, I've been nervous about accents. I mean, no casting has happened that I hated, but early on in the process, I did a lot of saying, I've checked out their accent on YouTube, and I don't think they can do the accent we want. So, I was probably the kind of the accent scout. But I can't think of any other aspects of casting that made me really tense.
And there's a question here from Irma Jacob, and it says, I recently had a memoir published, a Douglas tale growing up in interracial or in intercultural Flanagan town in Trinidad, for which I've received treatment from the book publisher to be sold to a Hollywood producer. What can I reasonably expect at this stage? This is probably different in, there are many different answers as there are treatments out there in the world, but is there any advice that you can give to Irma? I'm going to take that as a no. I'll let you think about it. And we'll, I mean, there are many avenues at this point that this could take. So I would say get a lawyer probably is the best advice right now.
Yes.
We're almost out of time here. Sandy Crouse-Nick wants to know, what is everyone currently working on? Margaret, I'll start with you.
Oh, Lord. I'm not telling.
Okay. Clement, you seem like you...
What if I then don't finish it? Then people say, well, you said you were blah, blah, and you didn't do it. Why not? So no, I never tell.
Are you sitting at the desk that you write at right now as we speak?
I don't write at just one desk.
No. Yeah.
In fact, I don't always write at a desk. So let us say I'm sitting at one of the desks I might possibly write at.
She's gonna put a paper bag over her head.
Yeah, no, soon. I know. I can
Second
sense that's
Richard.
coming. I can sense it's coming. Clement, you've mentioned a couple of projects here. What are you currently working on?
I'm finishing my current film, Brother. It's based on David Cherian's novel, and I'm working on a miniseries on S.C. Dugan's novel, Half Let Loose. I'm working on a 6-part miniseries for that. So hopefully, that will happen. But like Margaret says, you never know. But this one, I have a good feeling about.
And do you always have a number of projects working at the same time? Is that just part of how you make a living and how it has to be?
Yeah, for me, yes, I have to have a number of things going at once. I sort of, because that's the way you survive as a filmmaker, as a producer, as a writer, at least for me. So I'm always, there's always a few things that's on the front burner, and then I'm always reading other things, trying to read novels or articles, or someone sends me a script. Absolutely.
Sarah, what are you working on?
I'm just finishing my adaptation of Women Talking by Miriam Taves. We're just in the final stages of it.
The final stages, yeah. And
Yeah, we're in
then
the
does it
soundbox.
go to film festivals afterwards, or?
That's the idea if we're lucky, yeah, in the fall.
Yeah. And Emma?
A film adaptation of my novel, The Pull of the Stars, and the next 2 novels and a musical. Like Clement says, we have to, throw a lot of balls in the air and hope one of them will catch the light.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for the insight and for taking the time to speak to me and everyone who's out there. There's lots of questions here. We're pretty much out of time, though, so I want to bring Alana back in. She has a couple of closing remarks, and away we go. But thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enormous thanks to Richard and all the panelists tonight for sharing your time and talents and generosity of spirit. It was a really exhilarating and edifying conversation, not just to me, but I'm sure to all our viewers. To all our viewers, I hope you enjoyed hearing from these powerhouse storytellers. Tonight's panel will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days if you want to catch it again or tell your friends about it. Please join us for our next Power Panel on June 13th, where we celebrate Indigenous History Month. Visit our website for registration information. Thank you again, and good night.
See you later.
Yeah.